Hi everyone, on behalf of Elastic Security, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to view this presentation recorded for Black Hat 2020. And this presentation is for anyone who'd like to learn a methodology to hunt for adversary tradecraft in an organization's network before an attacker can cause damage and loss. And our goal is to help you get started with threat hunting and share a repeatable process that you can refine over time to fit your team and organization. So my name is David French, and presenting with me today is Devon Kerr.
Howdy.
And we're members of the Elastic Security team, specifically working on the intelligence and analytics team, which is led by Devon. And our team has several years experience in various cybersecurity domains, including digital forensics and incident response, detection engineering, and threat hunting. And our team is responsible for researching attacker behavior and developing rules and machine learning jobs for detection to help organizations protect their data from attack. And everyone on our team is passionate about helping the community through sharing knowledge and increasing the cost of an attack for threat actors. For example, we recently made all of our detection rules public to help security operations teams with monitoring and detection and to develop rules alongside the security community. So by the end of this presentation, we want you to be comfortable with a process to plan and execute a hunt for attacker behavior. We'll start off by explaining what an attack lifecycle framework is, how they can be helpful, and walk through how you can use our favorite one. And we'll share a repeatable hunt process that you can use and improve over time to fit your needs. And finally, we'll walk through a practical example of how to hunt for attacker behavior, from forming a hunt hypothesis to converting a hunt query to a detection and Elastic Security to alert on that suspicious behavior when it occurs in future. So the goal of an attack lifecycle framework is to help us break down the various phases of an attack and explain the techniques that could be used in each phase. So for example, in the credential access phase of an attack, where an adversary is attempting to steal credentials, they might try and accomplish this by installing a keylogger on an endpoint to capture the victim's keystrokes when they enter their username and password.
Now, you can think about attack like a universal translator. It's just a knowledge base that lets you and I, as members of this community, communicate a little bit more effectively and develop comprehension about how adversaries are achieving various objectives. Attack is one of many. It's the latest, but probably not the last.
Yeah, so there are a few attack lifecycle frameworks to choose from. So MITRE's attack framework breaks down the phases of an attack by tactic, technique, and procedure, and we'll explain those concepts in more detail soon. An attack is really a knowledge base of adversary behavior based on real-world observations. So it includes useful information on how to detect threats, mitigate risk, and reduce the effectiveness of techniques in your environment. And Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain is a linear type of model that identifies the steps that an attacker has to take in order to achieve their objective, from reconnaissance all the way through to their final actions, whether that's stealing data or encrypting it and holding it to ransom. And then you have Mandiant's cyber attack lifecycle. It's less of a linear model than the cyber kill chain. It communicates that an attacker might operate in some phases of an attack more than once before completing their mission. So for example, they might perform privilege escalation and reconnaissance before moving laterally to other endpoints multiple times during an intrusion.
We're going to be focusing today on, just a few of the many attributes of attack. So if you're interested in how we perceive attack and some ways that you might be able to find, ways to make it more actionable, certainly check out our own blog about using MITRE ATT&CK or Blake's excellent 101 blog post. Both excellent resources that should really help you to up your game and start adopting attack. This is the matrix. Welcome. Attack organizes each of these techniques by tactic. This is another way of describing adversary objectives. It is, in a lot of ways, literally a means to an end. Techniques, these are the means. Alphabetically ordered. There are over 200 of them. And some of them are going to be very specific and others will be very generic. If we want to think about techniques from the perspective of an adversary, executing a technique successfully is how you achieve goals. For example, if you gain initial access through spear phishing, you would say that the tactic is initial access, the technique is spear phishing attachment. And again, this is just a way for us to start looking at adversary behaviors as building blocks. Be aware that one technique can have numerous variations. In some cases, many hundreds of different versions of that specific technique due to just the flexibility of the software environment. If we dig in a little bit deeper, looking at one specific technique like spear phishing attachment, you can kind of see how they're organized. You've got very clear technique and tactic associations. You've got affected platforms and this really wonderful section on procedural examples. So think of these as, real world applications that are relevant to that technique. And like all other indicators, shelf life, may be very, very, very short. The utility of those might be limited. Now, each technique also has a numeric identifier. This is like really shorthand for a technique. It makes it a little bit easier for us to describe instead of spear phishing attachment T1193. Once you start to learn those numeric IDs, it gets a little bit easier to reference. This also illustrates data sources. It's not enough that you can write a rule for a thing. You actually have to have the right data, something relevant for that. And so this just gives you some examples of the types of data, which may or may not be specific, that you want to have in order to minimally detect this technique, this behavior. And again, some of these will be very specific and others will be a little bit more generic. Here, if we look at mitigations, mitigation's a fancy word for preventions. These are techniques or controls or solutions which might be able to impact the outcome. If we're talking about a phishing attachment, antivirus technology that can detect those malicious phishing attachments would be a good example of a mitigation. Be aware that mitigations are not bulletproof vests. They're not black and white. It doesn't mean that because you have antivirus, you don't have to worry about spear phishing. It just means that the presence of antivirus will reduce the risk of that particular technique threat. And as we continue on, you can see we've got some detection notes here. And this talks about how to be successful as a security organization when you want to strategize around that particular technique. Note that each technique is going to have different detections, mitigations, and details. And that's actually really relevant. It means that we can't treat all techniques as equal. They've all got to be assessed kind of in our environment by their own merits.
And as we mentioned earlier, attack is a knowledge base of adversary behavior. So each technique has a list of references to external resources. And if you're looking to do a deep dive on a technique, these kind of resources can help you understand how attackers have executed the technique in the wild and how practitioners can defend against the technique. You'll also find things like references to malware analysis reports and offensive tools that are capable of executing the technique. If you're looking to do a deep dive on any of the techniques and understand how it works, this section is going to be incredibly useful to you.
But so attack is just a knowledge base. And what that means is that it only does some of the work of, improving your security organization. The real work, the hard work, it's actually making this all procedural to make it repeatable, measurable, quantifiable. And once you do those things, then you've achieved a certain level of maturity. And it may seem like documentation and rigorous procedure are not very mature, that those are sort of the crutches of maybe a less mature organization. But until you do that hard work, all of your wins are temporary. All of your losses are a little bit more long lasting. And again, these are things that are relatively easy. And when we see security organizations that are mature, they almost universally adopt these qualities, which I think is a good endorsement. Detection science, though, is a little new. Typically, it begins with this notion of a hypothesis or a theory. the thing that you intend to prove or disprove. And those give us answers about the state of the security domain. Like we understand if our entity, or if our organization is secure rather, based on doing these hunts and the review of the results. Those also tell us if, we are, learning things that can be preserved as institutional knowledge, building environmental awareness and things like that. If you learned that every account in a given environment had some very specific attribute, and you didn't write that down, every time you look at those accounts, you have to relearn that lesson. And the hypothesis-driven hunts sort of give us a justification for collecting some of that detail, preserving it over time, and then using it to make future hunts a little bit better. So there's a notion of like iterative growth over time. And I think that those are important concepts here. When you're establishing the hypothesis, you're sort of bounding the problem. You're making sure the task is not going to be endless. And if it never ends, how can you possibly measure it or have a sense of efficacy? And those are really important for these hunts. We'll talk about why in a moment. Poor hunting hypotheses, they generally aren't scoped narrowly enough. And that means the work can be indefinite. It means the cost can be indefinite. And it means that you never really know whether that's been addressed.
So to help you grasp the concepts we've spoken about so far, we're going to walk through the hunt process from start to finish using a practical example. So firstly, we need to identify we need to form our hunt hypothesis. So we're going to identify the tactic, technique, and procedure that we're going to hunt for. And in this example, we're going to hunt for the bits jobs technique that's in the persistence tactic or column in the attack matrix. The procedure goes into the details of how the technique can be executed. So remember, there can be many different procedures for executing the same technique. And in this example, we're going to look for an attacker using the Windows bits admin binary to create a persistent bits job that downloads and executes malicious code. So an attacker can accomplish this by using one or more of the command line arguments mentioned on this slide. And now that we've identified the TTP that we're going to hunt for, we're going to state that in our hypothesis clearly. So an adversary is maintaining persistence in my environment after creating a bits job using a bits admin binary. This hypothesis includes the tactic, technique, and procedure we're going to hunt for. It's clear and concise, and then we can move on to think about how we're going to prove or disprove it. So before we roll up our sleeves and go hunting, there are a few other decisions we need to make. So all of these decisions, again, should be documented and shared with your team. So just an example, we've decided that a couple of team members will spend up to 5 business days on this hunt. And like Devin mentioned, so it's important to set these kind of time limits. A more complex hunt could go on for months. And this kind of time bounding helps your team avoid scope creep. And you need to also consider what data sources will you use. Are you going to hunt in more than one data set? How long will you look back in those logs? Will you look back 3 months, 6 months, as far back as possible? And then are any systems off limits during your hunt? So for example, have you been asked not to interact or collect data from certain systems during business hours to reduce the risk of disrupting any business operations? And again, documentation is important. You're going to hear us say this a few times. It helps your team communicate effectively. Capturing decisions you make and lessons learned helps your team get better each time and transfer knowledge and wisdom to others on the team. So in this example, we're ready to start hunting, and we open up Discover in Kibana to do a quick smoke test and gain some environmental awareness. So we're searching for the bits admin process activity for the last year. And our results are returned in a couple of seconds. We see in this example, 858 events returned where the process name is bits admin. This seems like a pretty manageable number of events to deal with at first glance, but still reviewing them one by one would take a lot of time, and it's going to be pretty cumbersome for an analyst. So let's move on to build a visualization in Kibana to try and analyze the results more effectively and look for potential abuse of bits jobs. So by using Visualize in Kibana, we're searching for the bits admin process events again, but this time we're aggregating results by the command line value, and then we're sorting those events in ascending order. So we can see a couple of the command line values have occurred between 300 and 500 times during the last year. If we wanted to investigate those further, we could aggregate the results by host name. And then we can see if this is something that's happening on a single endpoint or across our fleet of endpoints. If this was something that was happening across hundreds of endpoints in our environment, we could probably assume that it's benign. And again, once you make those decisions to filter activity as benign, you can document the details of those decisions to preserve that knowledge. So in this example, you can see there are 4 rare command line values. One of them does stick out. It has a URL and it's referenced in a DLL. So as a threat hunter, your next logical questions to follow up on this lead might be things like, when did this event occur? Which endpoint? Who was logged on to that endpoint at the time? What else happened on that endpoint around the same time that this event occurred? Investigating leads like this can have a huge payoff. So if this was a recent event, you really have a chance to identify an attacker and deal with them before damage or loss occurs. And this will be a huge win for your hunt team. So we're moving on to writing detection rules. So this shouldn't be a primary goal of your threat hunting team, but if you do have a hunt query where you spent the time to match the suspicious behavior and where you've made these decisions to filter benign activity, it might make sense to automate that hunt, run it on a regular cadence, and then alert your security analysts if that behavior occurs in future. So in this example, we're going to use the query on this slide to create a new detection rule. So we're going to click on Manage Detection Rules in Elastic SIEM. And in this example, we're going to choose the winlog beat data source and then enter the query for our custom rule. And once this rule is created, our analysts will be alerted if the behavior occurs on any of the hosts on our network in future. And then finally, a mature security operations team will test their detections on a regular basis. In this example, we simulated the malicious activity and ensured that an alert was generated in the SIEM. So at this point, we've proved our hypothesis true, and we've written a new rule to detect the suspicious behavior in future. And you might ask yourself if you're done at this point, but there are some other things to consider. So remember, there are often more than one procedure to execute a technique, and this is true of bitch jobs. So if an attacker used PowerShell commandlets or Windows API calls to create and execute a malicious bitch job, this would evade the detection that you just created. So you might need additional data sources to detect all of those procedures. But on the other hand, if you detect a bitch job being abused by monitoring Windows API calls, you might not have to concern yourself with detecting bitch jobs being abused using other higher level procedures. SpectreOps published an excellent series on capability abstraction, and it goes into these concepts in more detail.
Yeah, I think as much fun as the analysis is, when I think about wrapping up a threat hunt, my mind always goes to reporting and documentation and what did we learn, how best to preserve all of those details. Knowing, for example, that the hunt query was so successful it produced a rule, that's a great finding. It's a finding we should capture. We should explain what our expectations were and what we found. I think that that's a great way for us to preserve our process, and that becomes sort of like something we could transfer to new analysts. Maturity is a function of process and documentation more often than not. And it's one of the things that I think a lot of organizations skip out on because it is a little bit challenging and it does require, a slightly different skill set. But that's a very important skill set to cultivate. Documentation preserves institutional knowledge. The thing that you're paying the managed security support provider, the MSSP, to deliver, like those managed security services companies have institutional knowledge that would take most customer organizations a long time to cultivate and develop. That's the value proposition. So, when you are using your own institutional knowledge, you don't want to lose that. You want to make sure that that gets captured. A lot of times that's going to be unique to your enterprise. It's not going to translate between two companies, even in the same vertical, because they could have different topologies. They could have different IT administration, procedures. They could have slightly different philosophies on the role of least privilege within the enterprise. All of those factors, even though they seem relatively minor or relatively inconsequential, collectively make each enterprise slightly unique. Not quite unicorns, but very close. And that means that all the things that you learn in the course of a hunt should be captured. If you don't, then you have no way to filter out the most common software configurations that cause false positives. You don't really know what each endpoint commonly has installed for different groups of users. You won't know if you had an incident last year, how you dealt with it. So you won't be able to predict if it will be, happening next year as a result of the same factors. And again, all of these inconsequential things give you sort of like a Groundhog's Day situation. You wake up, you hunt every day, and the landscape doesn't change. But if we start to document, then we can learn. History is repeatable, and of course, all it takes is that first nudge. For the most part, functional capability of measurement is expensive. All of these different analysts who are hunting, they're not free. You've got to have them collecting data all the time, analyzing data all the time, and the value is identifying threats before they become much greater than they are, or identifying things that can be fixed to prevent future threats. And of course, hunt teams that are doing that, there's largely, I think, a sense of positive sentiment about their contributions. But people in the business will want to know you're using the dollars and the bytes very wisely. You collect all process history from 100,000 endpoints and shove that into a cloud, storage solution to do some searching. That is a cost that you have to offset. But reporting, gives you the ability to justify those costs. Yes, we did this, but we had these findings, or we're able to make these assertions about our security. We looked and we didn't find these things which we expected because they were here last time, but they've been corrected, and now we're a feedback loop for improving the security and the defensiveness of the enterprise. Taking credit, I think, is sometimes challenging for folks in our position, but it is also one of the best ways to measure how you're effectively dealing with adversaries. And again, when you report those things up, you're really investing in leadership's comprehension. You're helping them understand our language, and that's again going to be a really valuable outcome. Roberto Rodriguez and I gave a talk on some of the metrics that you might want to collect relative to threat hunting. It contains some interesting measurements that most folks will find accessible. And please give that a shot if you haven't seen it already. It might help you to choose some reasonable metrics for getting started with your new hunt program.
So in this presentation, we walked through a process for planning and executing a hunt for adversary behavior. We talked about cyber attack frameworks and showed how the attack framework and its knowledge base of adversary behavior can be used. We discussed the benefits of having a repeatable process for preparing and executing a hunt on a hunt hypothesis before walking through a practical example. And again, having a plan will help your team avoid the pitfall of hunting without direction or being able to say when you're done with the hunt. And then after working to prove or disprove your hypothesis, you can build up this portfolio of hunts where you can measure your team's success and show the value of your team to your organization. For example, how many incidents have you identified and escalated? How many additional data sources have been onboarded to your SIEM to help cover blind spots? How many new detections have been created to alert your SOC when malicious behavior occurs? So these things are going to help you really demonstrate that the team is improving and really adding value to your organization. And then finally, again, err on the side of more documentation, capturing your findings, decisions made, problems that came up, any lessons learned. This is not only going to help others on your team, but it helps transfer knowledge and wisdom to any new people who join or anyone maybe transferring from another department within your company. And then documentation makes it easy to preserve and share successes with stakeholders. So a short report maybe after each hunt with an executive summary helps people with all technical abilities understand what your team did and how it helped the organization in some way. So thanks for watching our talk, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of Black Hat.
Yeah, if you want to learn more about how intelligence and analytics works, come join us in the Detection Rules channel of the Community Elastic Slack. Star the Detection Rules GitHub repo. We would love to see community contributions. And again, share some of this experience with all of you.